coming up.
And we've heard in previous testimony that these ESG investment strategies have broadly underperformed typical portfolios, more diversified strategies by more than about 250 basis points per annum over the past 5 years. And if this Liberal NDP coalition decided to impose an ESG mandate on the CPP or any other pension funds in this country, it would cost Canadians potentially tens of billions of dollars in lost income and lost security for their retirement and their futures.
Professor Party, I have a couple of quotes that are attributed to you here. I quote, "There is no rationale for Canada to have any emissions reductions targets of any kind." Another quote, "Anthropogenic climate change theory is like a zombie. It won't die no matter the evidence." Are those your quotes?
No, I don't recall the second one, but the first one definitely so, yes.
Mr. Chair, this is the second week in a row that Conservatives have brought witnesses to committee that argue against ambitious climate action. And Mr. Party published an article criticizing the Supreme Court for stating that climate change is an existential threat to Canada. He posted on the platform X.
How many megatons of emissions will be reduced in Canada by implementing OSFI's climate-related financial disclosure expectations?
Professor Party, you were unable earlier to respond fully to a question from Mr. Van Couverton, and Ms. Collins made a statement about one of your Twitter posts that you didn't have the opportunity to respond to. Would you care to take a minute to say what you would have said in response?
Yes, thank you very much.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
If your objective was to prevent Canadian businesses from succeeding in the global economy, how would you do it? Here are some ideas. You could impose taxes on your businesses and consumers of a type that other nations do not have. You could create regulatory barriers that prevent projects from being built, while other countries with rich natural resources and terrible environmental records beat us to the punch. And while you're at it, you could sign on to international obligations that these other countries do not share. And finally, you could find a way to starve your primary industries of capital. And that's the idea that you are exploring here.
Mr. Party, in your opening remarks, you alluded to the fact that good business leaders are already paying attention to what is going on in terms of market dynamics and in terms of risk. Is there any evidence that you've found that pension funds and financial institutions aren't paying attention to that risk or those market dynamics, and that the government should or needs to impose new regulations on them?
None that I'm aware of, no. I mean, the test of risk for a pension fund or a company is whether or not you're succeeding in the marketplace. If you are a pension fund and not paying attention to risk and your investments decline in value, well, then you're not doing very well. And you didn't need government regulations to demonstrate that. I think we're in danger of conflating two different kinds of risk. One is the risk to a company, and that is the risk that the company's in the business to manage. The other risk is the one that you want to impose upon them, which is the risk of global climate change. And I'm not saying that's not a risk. I'm saying you're trying to internalize it onto the companies instead of being governmental about it and establishing your own rules about it instead of trying to make them do it for you.
Do you think it's a risk when you have politicians playing around, meddling with CPP, our major pension funds, which is the biggest safety net in which Canadians rely on across this country? Is that also a risk that we should be considering, the fact that we are intentionally trying to starve out the financing of energy projects that have major implications for our country?
Yes, so you're splitting the loyalties of the pension. You're trying to say, well, you want to provide returns to the people that you're going to support in their old age, but we also want you to pay attention to something else. And that, as often as not, is going to diminish the returns you produce for those first group of people. So the best policy is a straightforward one, which is that the pension should be able to pursue the best returns available because those companies they're investing in are acting within the law. The government meddling just messes the whole thing up.
And we've heard in previous testimony that these ESG investment strategies have broadly underperformed typical portfolios, more diversified strategies by more than about 250 basis points per annum over the past 5 years. And if this Liberal NDP coalition decided to impose an ESG mandate on the CPP or any other pension funds in this country, it would cost Canadians potentially tens of billions of dollars in lost income and lost security for their retirement and their futures. In your assessment, is that an accurate portrayal?
I don't have those numbers at my fingertips, but let me say this. The difference that we are talking about. So I am not here to argue against a company deciding to take on certain kinds of priorities, to get certification, to adopt guidelines. I'm not suggesting that at all. As long as they decide to do that in the interest of the company, that's great. What we're talking about is the government imposing mandatory rules. You're not allowing the company to make the judgment about the risk or about the investment or about the productivity or about the profit. You are making those decisions for you. The division is between voluntary and mandatory.
We've heard in previous testimony that rather than divestment, investment is the more prudent approach, particularly given the other nations that will provide these fuel sources, energy sources, if Canada does not. Is it fair to say that this approach is actually the exact opposite? We should be investing in new clean technologies to reduce our emissions of our particular energy sources while simultaneously keeping that investment in Canada?
Was as I alluded to, the Canadian energy is actually a tremendous source of solutions for reducing global carbon emissions. It's not the main source of the problem. It could be a great source of the solution. But the fact that we are knee-jerk about this, and we think that we shouldn't develop anything in this country. That is not what other countries are doing. Other countries who have natural resources are digging up lots and lots of coal in China and India. I'm sure you've been told this. And they produce, China in particular, China is far and away, the largest carbon producer on the planet. And their obligations under the Paris Agreement are essentially non-existent. If we exported natural gas to China, the bang for the buck would be far greater than any of the provisions that you are contemplating putting in place.
A number of years ago, there was a Supreme Court decision that stated directors owe a fiduciary duty to the corporation and only to the corporation, end quote. Could a government-imposed ESG mandate on private companies actually conflict with their fiduciary duties?
Absolutely, of course, yes. And what you get is split loyalties, as I alluded to earlier. So the way that investors are protected in our economy is that the directors and officers, as you allude to, owe a fiduciary duty to the corporation. And what the courts have said is that that fiduciary duty means that they must try to maximize the profit of the company for the sake of the shareholders.
Thank you.
And if instead the government mandates a split loyalty and makes those directors and officers serve another master, then the fortunes of those investors will
Mr.
decline.
Van Couverden.
Professor Party, I have a couple of quotes that are attributed to you here. I quote, "There is no rationale for Canada to have any emissions reductions targets of any kind." Another quote, "Anthropogenic climate change theory is like a zombie. It won't die no matter the evidence." Are those your quotes?
No, I don't recall the second one, but the first one definitely so, yes.
Okay, so do you believe that climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions from human activities?
So I'm not a scientist, sir. I'm a lawyer.
Good. That was actually my next question.
So I am not here to debate science.
Okay, good.
The science of climate with you.
I'm glad. That was my next question.
Hold on.
That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, fair enough.
My next question was whether or not you had any academic training in climatology or environmental science, and you answered that question gratefully. We have many experts here, so I'll go over to Dr. Ellen Quigley.
First of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you for putting forward the Climate Aligned Finance Act. It is an important piece of legislation. We have OSFI here with us, and they brought in their guidelines, B15, that require financial institutions to improve their governance and risk management practices, but it falls short of requiring them to align with Canada's climate commitments. And can you talk a little bit about why it doesn't go far enough?
I recognize and I thank OSFI for putting out this guideline, but unfortunately is the minimum. And it doesn't make us move because transparency is equivalent to a diagnostic. So it's like telling a patient, you have cancer, and then bye-bye, see you later. They have to mitigate, they have to manage, and they have to reduce the emissions. So this is the way we manage risk. So we have to control it, we have to mitigate it, and at the end, we really have to stop it. And so to stop, we have to reduce emissions. And to reduce emissions, we need the financial sector. And the financial sector needs to be aligned with our climate commitments, which is maximum 1.5 degrees, net zero 2050.
Thanks so much. And we heard from another witness here today that this kind of action would be detrimental to the Canadian economy and that other countries aren't doing this. But actually, Canada's behind 40 other countries when it comes to aligning our financial institutions with our climate commitments. Can you talk a little bit about how this actually could be a benefit to the Canadian economy?
Absolutely, because it's about opportunities. When risk is there, yes, there is a danger, but there is also the opportunities. And so when you innovate in order to mitigate the emissions, then you will create new technology. Then you will create a different economy. And, I don't need to tell you that we didn't abandon the Stone Age for lack of stones. We abandoned that age because there were better, cleaner, safer, cheaper ways of doing the same thing. And that's the idea.
Can you expand a little bit on how these kind of robust regulatory tools, legislative tools, will impact banks, pension funds, jobs, affordability?
30 seconds. In 30 seconds, please, Senator.
It will enable the Sustainable Job Act. Without money, you cannot have your Sustainable Job Act.
Mr. Party, you're a lawyer, correct? Correct. You mentioned that public companies already have an obligation to consider and declare risks for investors. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Of course. Sure. So there are some companies that are publicly listed on stock exchanges and people buy shares. And so, for example, if you're a company subject to the Ontario Securities Commission, they have a whole list of requirements that these public companies have to meet in terms of the disclosure, the material risks and change and so on. And if they don't do that, then they'll be in breach of those security rules. More principally, the whole idea of a business enterprise is to be responsible to the people that you that invest in you. And so that's the definition of an entrepreneur, someone who takes risk and manages it.
Thank you. Mr. Rutledge, how many megatons of emissions will be reduced in Canada by implementing OSFI's climate-related financial disclosure expectations?
When financial institutions begin to measure their counterparties for emissions, they will make pragmatic, empirically driven decisions on whether to continue to expose themselves to those institutions over time. And to the extent that institution decides to lower their exposure to emitters of greenhouse gases, then they'll pull capital. It is not our job nor our intent to measure the reduction of emissions in the broader economy by forcing disclosure. It is our job and intent to measure the risks financial institutions expose themselves so their boards and senior managers can make sound, risk-based judgments.
So you're not worried about reducing emissions? It's not one of the wanted outcomes, but okay. Mr. Rutledge, how much does it cost financial institutions to meet OSFI's climate-related financial disclosure expectations?
A very, very quick answer, please. If you have the figure. If you don't, you can send it to us.
Yeah. There was a study done for a small or medium-sized bank where the burden would be highest. To meet our disclosure, or rather measurement rules or requirements, it would be about 50 to 100,000. 50 to 100,000.
Can you please table that?
Yeah, could you send us something in writing on that, Mr. Rutledge?
Thank you.
There was also a study by the IMF
we got to keep going, Mr. Sorry,
yes, both studies, please.
Madame Châtel.
We'll table both.
This is the second week in a row that Conservatives have brought witnesses to committee that argue against ambitious climate action. And Mr. Party published an article criticizing the Supreme Court for stating that climate change is an existential threat to Canada. He posted on the platform X, quote, "Even if you believe in anthropogenic climate change, there's no rationale for this country to have emission reduction targets of any kind." The fact that my Conservative colleague, Mr. Leslie, spent his entire questioning time giving this person space to add their testimony into our report, I think is appalling, to be honest.
Professor Party, you were unable earlier to respond fully to a question from Mr. Van Couverton, and Ms. Collins made a statement about one of your Twitter posts that you didn't have the opportunity to respond to. Would you care to take a minute to say what you would have said in response?
Yes, thank you very much. So, my analysis assumes that everything that Mr. Van Couverton would say about climate change is true. It accepts the proposition that there is anthropomorphic climate change and that the situation is as has been widely suggested. I'm not suggesting to the contrary. The point is this, that if we think that that is true, if this is really an emergency, and if the planet is actually burning, then the things that you are suggesting are wholly inadequate, which means that maybe that you don't believe it yourselves. So here's an analogy. If there's a burning house, your house is burning down, and you've got no fire department, you've got no hose, you've got no water, until you grab your neighbor's cup of coffee and you throw it on the fire because it's wet. And you say, well, we're doing something about it. No, you're not. And you're doing nothing about it. All of these will have no effect because Canada is not the source of carbon emissions. Yeah, 1.5%. But as I alluded to earlier, the main source of carbon emissions are other countries with big populations and lots of coal and no restrictions in international regimes like the Paris Agreement. So if you're serious about this, then you need to find a different path to find an actual solution to the actual problem you're claiming exists.
That we could increase Canadian prosperity and decrease global emissions by increasing natural gas exports to Asia and increasing Canadian exports of nuclear technology. Could you elaborate on how that would be beneficial?
I'm afraid there's only 15 seconds to elaborate.
Both those things would displace other activities that would produce more carbon emissions.